The storeroom beneath the west wing of Cauldshaw Palace had a number instead of a name, and for 22 years, almost nobody used either. It sat behind a door that stuck in the damp months, past a corridor the palace tour never included, at the end of a hallway lit by a single bulb the maintenance staff kept meaning to replace and never quite got around to. Inside, under a canvas sheet gone gray with dust, leaned a portrait of Queen she had been dead for 2 decades. In that time, the kingdom had put her face on a commemorative stamp, a wing of the children's hospital she'd championed, and the opening credits of a documentary the state broadcaster re-aired every August. On the anniversary, nobody in the family ever called by its actual name. They simply called it the week, and everyone in the household knew which week was meant. What the kingdom had not done in all that time was hang her portrait in the Hall of Queens, the long gallery in Cauldshaw, where the consorts and queens regnant of 6 centuries looked down from gilt frames onto polished stone, the one wall in the palace. That was supposed to say, permanently, these women mattered here. Crown Prince Rowan had counted the gap in that wall every year of his adult life. He knew exactly how many paces it was from the portrait of his grandmother to the blank stretch of silk wallpaper where his mother's should have been 11 if you kept close to the left side of the corridor, 13 if you drifted toward the windows the way most visitors did, drawn instinctively toward the light. He had counted it as a boy in short trousers being marched through the hall on school holiday tours of the state rooms, and he had counted it as a grown man walking a foreign head of state past the same wall, making the same practiced small talk about the artists in the centuries, while some other part of his mind did the arithmetic it had never once failed to do. He had been 15 when he walked behind her coffin. He was 39 now, and he had never once, in public, let anyone see what that gap cost. The portrait itself had been commissioned the year before Sable died, when she was 32, and by every account of the people who'd worked around her, at the peak of whatever quality it was that made strangers feel personally known by her within about 90 seconds of meeting her. The artist, an elderly Vassenmori painter named Colm Farrow, who had spent most of his career on landscapes and had taken the commission almost as an afterthought, later told an interviewer it was the strangest sitting of his life, not because the Queen was difficult, but because she kept trying to make him comfortable, asking about his daughters, remembering their names on the second sitting, bringing him tea herself instead of ringing for it, sitting on the floor of his studio at one point to look at a stack of his old landscape sketches propped against the wall. He said that when she finally saw the finished canvas, she stood in front of it for nearly a full minute without speaking. Then she said, quietly, that she hoped it made people feel the way she tried to make them feel when she met them, which was seen and not performed at. The portrait was meant to travel from Farrow's studio directly to the Hall of Queens the following spring, in time for a small unveiling ceremony that the household calendar had already tentatively penciled in. Sable died in a car accident that winter on a wet road outside the capital, 3 weeks after her 33rd birthday. The unveiling was never held. The canvas went into storage instead, wrapped for a display that kept getting postponed for reasons nobody ever wrote down until postponement became policy by default, and policy by default became, eventually, simply the way things were, the kind of arrangement that nobody chooses on purpose and everybody somehow ends up responsible for. Queen Elira, second wife of King Aldrich, had never asked for the portrait to be hidden. That was the version she told herself on the nights it was easiest to believe. What she had actually done in the frantic weeks after Sable's death was smaller and more deniable than that she had simply never asked for it to be found. She had moved into rooms Sable once lived in and repainted them, choosing a pale gray that the decorator described in his notes as a fresh start. She had let the household staff quietly relocate photographs, one at a time, over years, until a person walking the halls of Cauldshaw in any given decade could be forgiven for not noticing that Sable's face was disappearing from them a little more with every season. Nobody had signed an order. Nobody ever does in a house like that. You only need enough people willing to look away, and enough years for the looking away to calcify into custom. Until eventually the custom is simply mistaken for how things have always been. Alira told herself this was mercy, that a grieving family shouldn't be made to live inside a shrine to a woman who was gone, that children in particular needed somewhere new to stand rather than a museum of loss to grow up inside. She did not examine too closely why Mercy always seemed to serve her own comfort as well, or why the flowers Sable used to keep fresh in the morning room were the first thing to go, or why she had never once, in 11 years of marriage, asked Aldrich a single direct question about what his first wife had actually been like as a person, rather than as an absence she was competing against. She had never met Rowan's mother. She had married into the family 2 years after Sable's death, when Rowan was 17 and had a black tie he seemed to wear to every state occasion that year, and a face he had trained with a discipline that quietly unsettled the household staff who watched him do it into stillness. Alira had assumed, reasonably enough by her own lights, that time would soften whatever the boy carried, the way it seemed to soften most things eventually, given enough of it. She had married Aldrich for reasons that were, in fact, mostly sincere. She liked him. She liked the life. She believed she could be good at the parts of it that mattered, and for the most part she was. She had simply never once stopped to ask whether being good at the parts that mattered included making room, deliberately and visibly, for the woman who had come before her. It had not occurred to her that this was a choice she was making rather than a situation she had simply inherited, fully formed, on the day she married in. That failure of imagination would cost her everything, eventually, though it would take 20 years to come due, the way debts in families like this one always seem to. Rowan learned what his mother had actually been afraid of when he was 22, going through a locked drawer in her old writing desk that nobody had opened since her death, because nobody had thought to ask for the key, and because the desk itself had simply been moved to an unused sitting room and left there, the way objects belonging to the dead sometimes are. Half preserved and half forgotten at the same time. Inside was a single letter, unsent, addressed to no one in particular, the kind of thing a person writes at 2 a.m. when the fear is too large to keep entirely inside their own skull, but too shapeless yet to send to anyone real. In it, Sable had written about feeling watched, about a sense which she couldn't fully justify on paper, and seemed almost embarrassed to be writing down, that the machinery around her, the household, the schedule makers, the people who decided which car she took and when, which engagements she kept, and which were quietly reassigned to someone else, had started treating her less like a person to be protected and more like a problem to be managed. Until it resolved itself. She never said anyone wished her harm. She was careful, even in a letter to no one, not to accuse, but she wrote that she sometimes felt like a guest in a house that had already decided, quietly, that she would not be staying, and that the loneliest part of it was that nobody had ever said so out loud, which meant there was nothing she could argue against. Only a feeling she couldn't prove and couldn't shake, and no one to describe it to who wouldn't tell her, gently, that she was imagining things. Rowan read it twice, standing in the room, and then folded it back along its original creases and put it back in the drawer, because there was nowhere else it seemed to belong. He never told his father he'd found it. He told exactly one person, years later, on a night neither of them ever discussed again, his aunt. Princess Isolde, King Aldrich's older sister, had her own reasons for wanting that portrait back on the wall, and hers went back further than anyone else's. 30 years before Sable ever entered the family, Isolde had been engaged unofficially, but seriously, in the way that mattered to the people involved, to a diplomat named Corin Vane. The match was quietly ended by the Privy Council over a technicality of faith that nobody outside the family ever fully understood, and within a year, Corin had married a young woman named Petra, a distant cousin of Alira's, in a ceremony Isolde attended in the third pew from the front, in a hat chosen to give away nothing. She never spoke of it again, not once, in 30 years, to anyone, including her brother. That was simply how Isolde carried things, filed away, sealed shut, never touched in company, the way a person learns to carry something when the alternative is being told, gently but firmly, that duty comes first, and feelings can wait for a more convenient decade that never actually arrives. When Alira married into the family years later, Isolde treated her with the exact, correct, glacial courtesy of a woman who has decided a subject is closed and will remain closed for the rest of her natural life. It was not cruelty. It simply left no room for warmth, and Alira, to her credit, understood early on that no amount of charm was going to change that particular arithmetic, though she never fully understood why. She had watched Sable, too, watched her arrive at 19, bright and overwhelmed, and entirely unprepared for what the family's machinery would eventually do to her, and watched, years later, what was done to her memory once she could no longer object to it herself. Isolde had never said a word about that either. She simply remembered everything. With the patience of someone who has spent a lifetime discovering that patience is the only weapon the family ever lets a woman keep, and that some weapons only work if you're willing to wait 50 years to use them. She had, in fact, made a private habit over those years of visiting the storeroom herself twice a year. Without telling anyone, once in the spring and once in the week, nobody in the family named aloud, simply to stand in front of the wrapped canvas for a few minutes and confirm, to herself if no one else, that it was still there, still safe, still waiting for a door that would one day open properly, instead of by accident. Prince Edric, Rowan's younger brother by 2 years, had grown up in the same house with the same gap in the same wall, and had come to an entirely different conclusion about what to do with it. Where Rowan went quiet, Edric went loud. He'd said things about Alira in interviews that made the palace's communications office wince for a week afterward, nothing untrue, exactly, but said without the sanding down that 30 years of institutional training teaches a person to apply automatically, almost without noticing they're doing it. He'd left active royal duties in his late 20s, married outside the small circle the family usually chose from, and built a life several hundred miles from Coldshore that he described, more than once and pointedly, as finally being able to breathe. The brothers loved each other and had, for the better part of a decade, found it almost impossible to be in the same room for longer than the length of a formal photograph. Rowan believed patience was a form of respect for the institution their mother had, in her own complicated way, loved despite everything it had done to her. Edric believed patience was simply cowardice with better tailoring, and had said so once at a dinner that both of them still avoided mentioning. Neither of them was entirely wrong, and both of them knew it, which was part of what made the disagreement so hard to have out loud without it turning into something neither could take back. When Rowan called to tell him the portrait was finally going up, there was a long silence on the line, the kind Edric rarely allowed himself, having spent a decade cultivating the opposite habit. "You're actually doing it," he said eventually. "Good." Another pause, longer this time. "I mean that. I know you think I never noticed how much work you were doing while I was busy setting things on fire in public. I noticed. I just couldn't do it your way. I don't think I have your way in me." "I know," Rowan said. "I never needed you to." It was the closest the two of them had come in years to an apology that ran in both directions at once, and neither of them tried to improve on it by saying anything more, because they both understood that saying more would have ruined it. Rowan did not storm into the storeroom one afternoon with a decision made on impulse. He built the thing the way he built everything that mattered to him, slowly, on paper, in meetings nobody thought to ask him about. Over the course of nearly 2 years that he never described to anyone, even Marisol, as a project with a deadline, because a deadline was the one thing that could have made someone nervous enough to interfere. He requested the placement records for the Hall of Queens going back 100 years, so that when the moment came, there would be a documented precedent for every part of it, which portraits had been added by which monarch, under what authority, and how, and what the formal process required at each step. He met with the palace's chief curator 3 separate times to understand exactly which authority governed what hung on that wall, and confirmed, in writing, that as heir the decision was unambiguously his to make once the current monarch consented or declined to object. He had the frame restored quietly by a conservator who had done work for the family for 30 years and understood, without being told twice, that this particular job was not to be discussed outside the workshop, not even with his own apprentice. He asked his father directly, once, whether he had any objection to the portrait's return. King Aldrich did not say yes. He also did not say no. He looked at his son for a long moment, long enough that Rowan wondered if he was about to be told, gently, to let the whole thing go for the sake of peace in the household, the way so many difficult conversations in that family ended and said only, "Do what you think is right," which both of them understood to be a door left open rather than a door pushed through. It was, in its way, the most honest thing Aldrich had managed to say about his first wife in over 20 years, and both men knew that too, though neither said it. That was enough. Rowan scheduled the cleaning. He scheduled for a Tuesday evening when Alira was away at a hospital opening 2 hours outside the city, the actual hanging of the portrait, and he told almost no one, because the whole design of the thing was that once it was done, there would be nothing left to argue about. Not a headline, not a statement, just a painting on a wall, exactly where the historical record said it belonged, hung by people with the documented authority to hang it. There was a pause on the line long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. Then Isolde said good and nothing else, which from her was closer to weeping than most people's actual tears. The Hall of Queens was closed to the public that Tuesday for what the visitor schedule listed, blandly, as maintenance. A small crew of restorers and household staff people Rowan had spoken to personally, people he trusted not to make the moment into something it wasn't, carried the portrait wrapped in protective cloth, the way you carry something that has already been hurt once and does not deserve to be hurt again. Isolde was there. She hadn't been asked to be. She simply arrived, stood at the edge of the room with her hands folded, and watched, saying nothing to anyone the entire time, though one of the younger restorers said afterward that she seemed, for just a moment near the end, to be holding her breath. The wrapping came away slowly. Underneath it, Sable looked out from the canvas the way she had at 32, steady, a little amused, entirely unaware of everything that would happen to her image after she was gone. The frame went up. It was measured, leveled, measured again, because on a wall like that, an inch is never just an inch. 90 minutes after the crew began, Queen Sable of Vasenmore was hanging in the Hall of Queens, beside the portrait of Rowan's grandmother, exactly where the gap in the wall had been waiting for her for 22 years. That was all. No statement was ever drafted. None was needed by the next morning. Half the household staff had heard about it, and a household never really keeps a secret past its first telling. Alira came back from the hospital opening the next day, expecting an ordinary Wednesday. She found out from her private secretary, in the car 4 minutes before she reached the palace gates, and by the time she stepped out of that car, her face had already rearranged itself into something the staff in the entrance hall would later describe, carefully, as rigid. She asked for the portrait to be taken down. She was told, politely and with genuine regret, that the decision had already been finalized through the proper institutional channels and was not hers to reverse. She asked for a meeting with Rowan. He kept it, arrived exactly on time, listened to everything she said without once interrupting, and told her, without raising his voice, that the portrait was staying, and that he understood this was difficult for her, and that the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. She left the meeting having gotten nothing she'd asked for, and understanding, for the first time in 11 years, that she had never actually held the kind of power in that building she'd assumed she did, that it had always, quietly, belonged to someone else, and had simply never been called on before. She asked King Aldrich to intervene. He said nothing. He had known his son long enough and loved his wife enough to understand exactly what a phone call from him would cost the boy, and he chose, in that moment, not to spend it. It was the first time in 11 years of marriage that Alira had asked her husband for something and watched him simply let it happen anyway, without so much as a word in her defense. Later, alone in his study, he would think about the letter Rowan had once described to him, the one Sable had never sent, and wonder, not for the first time, whether his own silence back then, all those years ago, had been part of exactly what she'd meant. Isolde found Alira an hour later, alone in the small drawing room off the east corridor, sitting very straight in a chair by the window, with her hands folded in her lap in a way that mirrored, though neither woman would ever have noticed it, the way Isolde herself so often stood. Isolde didn't raise her voice either. She said 5 words, "It is what Sable deserved," and left before Alira could answer, because there was, in the end, nothing to answer with. Rowan's wife, Princess Marisol, had known about the gap in the wall since before they married. He'd told her about it on their 4th date, in the flat, unemotional voice he used for things that actually mattered to him, which she'd learned by then to recognize as the opposite of indifference. She hadn't been told the portrait was going up that Tuesday. She found out the same way most of the household did, secondhand, the next morning, and her first reaction when she finally reached him by phone was not congratulation, but something closer to concern. He was quiet long enough that she thought the line had dropped. "I know," he said eventually. "I think I've spent so long not telling people things that I forgot how to stop, even with the ones I trust." It was as close as he ever came in that entire year to an apology and an explanation folded into the same 6 seconds, and Marisol, who had married a man built almost entirely out of careful silences, understood it as both. She went to see the portrait herself that afternoon, alone, before the hall reopened to visitors. She stood in front of it for a long time, the way Pharaoh had once described Sable herself standing in front of it, and thought about the fact that her own children would grow up walking past that wall without ever once having to wonder, the way their father had, whether the woman who should have been on it belonged there. That, she decided, was the actual point of the whole quiet 22-year operation, not the reckoning with Alira, satisfying as that turned out to be, but the fact that the next generation would simply never have to ask the question at all. Aldrich had loved Sable in the disorganized, half-formed way of a very young man who marries before he entirely understands what marriage will ask of him, and he had loved Alira in the steadier, more deliberate way of someone who has already made one set of mistakes and is trying, consciously, not to repeat them. He had never once believed the two loves were in competition with each other, which was, he understood, only very late in his life. Part of the problem, because everyone around him had experienced them as being in competition, regardless of what he privately believed, and his refusal to choose a side out loud had simply meant that the choosing got done for him, silently, by a household that decided, on its own, whose comfort mattered more. On the night after the portrait went up, he went to the Hall of Queens by himself, long after the last of the household staff had gone home, and stood in front of Sable's portrait for the first time in 22 years. He did not stay long, but he stood there long enough to say, quietly, to a painting that couldn't hear him, that he was sorry it had taken this long, and that their son had turned out to be a far better man than he himself had ever managed to be braver in the particular, patient way that costs more than the loud kind of bravery ever does. Years later, when Rowan's own daughter was 7, she wandered off from a school tour of the staterooms, the same tour Rowan himself had once been marched through in short trousers, and found herself standing alone in front of the portrait in the Hall of Queens. A guide found her there a few minutes later and gently began to shepherd her back toward the group. But the girl didn't move right away. "Who is she?" the girl asked, pointing. "That's your grandmother," the guide said. "Queen Sable." The girl studied the painting for another moment, the way children do when they've decided a question is worth asking properly rather than moving on from. She looks like she's about to say something. The guide, who had worked in the palace long enough to remember the years when that particular stretch of wall had been silk wallpaper and nothing else, found she didn't quite trust her voice to answer, and simply nodded and let the girl look a little longer before leading her back to the group. When Rowan heard about it that evening, the guide mentioned it to his private secretary, almost as an aside, not realizing how far up the chain the story would travel. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said that was, in the end, exactly what he'd wanted. Not a speech, not an unveiling anyone remembered. Just a child stopping in front of a painting on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and asking who the woman was, the way you'd ask about anyone else who, obviously, uncomplicatedly, belonged there. Nothing about the rest of that year was dramatic. Exactly. There was no scandal in the papers, because nobody had ever intended there to be one. That had been the entire point of doing it quietly. But the household noticed things shift, the way households always do. Sable's old charities, the landmine clearance fund, and the children's hospice she'd championed started appearing again in official engagement calendars, folded into Rowan's schedule and his wife's. Her name came up, casually, in speeches, in a way it hadn't in years. Edric, of all people, sent his brother a short, uncharacteristically restrained message that simply said, "Saw the photos. Thank you." He came to Caldshore the following month for the first time in 3 years, and stood in front of the portrait for a long time without saying anything, which for Edric was its own kind of quiet. And every time Alira walked the long way to the state apartments, the route that happened to pass through the Hall of Queens, she passed a painting she had spent 2 decades trying not to think about, hanging exactly where it had always been meant to hang, in a house she had once believed she'd finished rearranging for good. Over time, something in her began, slowly and without ceremony, to change, not into warmth, not right away, but into something quieter than resentment, a kind of accommodation she had never allowed herself to make, while the wall still had a gap in it to hide behind.